Welcome, guys, and welcome to 1 week's critique of the week. We've got a very special three-person edition this week. As you know, 1 Week Critique is a literary studio, an online literary studio, where we give feedback on individual pieces in a week or less, and to expand the set, so to speak. We've started the critique of the week where we talk to professional writers and editors and interesting semi-professional writers and editors about the tremendous work that they do. Today we have Nicholas Taylor Greer, the phenomenal Nick Greer, who is an excellent writer, but also an incredible editor of both The Territory and Goodnight, Sweet Prince. Welcome, Nick. And we have as well our own Matthew Schmidt down at the bottom of the screen. So Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do as a writer, what you do as an editor, and what your magazines are about.
Yeah, I think as a writer, my focus is probably changing constantly, maybe a little too fast. I think it's probably most useful to talk about what I've been into recently, which is writing these like genre experiments. The language that I've been using to describe it, or like the critical language I've used, has been the term hypergenre, which is kind of, I don't know, kind of like a personal or pocket term that I've been pulling out to help myself talk about it. Yeah. Basically, the idea is, I think a lot of writing that's in genre is either trying to like dignify genre, like as if genre is not literary and therefore needs to be given a literary treatment, or it's like kind of an ironic treatment of it where genre is seen as like schlocky or, again, lesser somehow. And these treatments are maybe kind of hyper sincere, where there's an acknowledgement that there's some maybe absurdities or stupidities or arbitrariness to genre, but there isn't like as much of a value judgment about whether that's good or bad. That's more like textural, and let's like chew on that texture and like let's run with it and push it and see where that takes us. And so I've been basically just taking genres that I'm interested in, usually filmic ones, and just pushing their affects as far as I can stand to take them. And then, you know, and that could just be at the like image or sentence level, or at the narrative level as things kind of accumulate beyond these like little prose poemy fragments that I put together. So that's kind of what I've been doing recently. And I think I'm doing that part out of necessity. I'm like working full time and doing Territory a lot in my spare time. So that's been a big grind. So I've been trying to find these ways to do smaller, but very kind of like engaged and dedicated things. And so that's kind of what I've settled on. In terms of my editing practice, I think Territory and Goodnight, Sweet Prince are super different projects. Territory is like ostensibly about maps, but is about representation in general, and maybe the flaws and paradoxes of representation, hence the website name, The Map Is Not. And Goodnight, Sweet Prince is a little less twisty and turny, and a little less heady than that. It's a little more fun and casual, but you know, I still try to bring myself to it in a serious way as an editor, even if the end aesthetic is a little bit more fun. And that's about side characters in movies and other media, but primarily movies. And yeah, so that's like kind of that's my side piece project, right? Like side piece about side piece, basically. Yeah, so those are like the main things I've got going on. But you know, I'll get plenty distracted with something else next week. So yeah.
So to that, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit more about The Territory and Goodnight, Sweet Princes. I'm calling them project genres or literary rhizomata as hyper-specific journals in some way.
Yeah.
But also concepts. I'm interested in talking a little bit about how you got to the ideas that you got to and how you got off on those things. And I want to do that because, well, what we normally do in these conversations is introduce a poem or a short piece so that we can talk about how it got all the way through to its final version, or some version that the author is happy to present in whatever way they present it. Today, we're actually doing a piece that you edited by Matthew Schmidt, which is why he's hanging out quietly down at the bottom of the screen. But before we get to the poem itself, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about what is the territory, what is Goodnight, Sweet Prince, and how did that form for you, and how does that fit your thinking about writing and editing in general?
Yeah. I think they're fundamentally different in that territory came out of conversations that I had with my friend and co-editor, Tommy. I guess Thomas Mary Lopez is his formal writing name, but I'm going to call him Tommy because that's what I feel like. And so Tommy and I were basically looking for some way of building a shared like writing practice. Like we'd known each other since high school and happened to go to college together, and also happened to go to get an MFA together, and wanted to not just happen upon another, way to interact. We wanted to have a more maybe formal way of interacting. And a journal seemed like the right way of doing that, rather than say writing explicitly collaboratively, just because we had similar concerns about like maps as objects, or similar fascinations with the map as an object, mostly from like kind of a boyish perspective, where when we were little boys, we like to think of it maybe in the perspective of an adventure novel, the kind of like speculation you do when looking at a map, the stories that you inject into it based off of its like, even its like color scheme will maybe bias you to think a certain way about what kind of stories might live in there. We both really loved Tintin, and there was a kind of like, I don't know, kind of like a globe-trotting component to that was exciting and felt very mappy. And so we just kind of followed this like boyish interest to obviously much more cerebral and dark and compromised elements of the map, and basically built the format out of a desire to basically build an atlas, and like build an atlas around certain themes, starting with some of the more abstract theme of utopia, moving through more literal spaces like underworlds, and more literal like political territories like Arizona. And now we're doing an issue on Alaska, our 12th. That's what we're currently working on finishing. So it's kind of this excuse to hang out with my friend in this slightly more like serious artistic way, that taps into shared concerns, and has kind of gravitated towards this more cerebral space over time. That's been a lot more formal of a pursuit, in part because I'm doing it with this other person, and also because we kind of hit the ground running like that. I invested a lot in the visual design and making it look and feel a certain way, and we kind of put it out there like a really formal publication. And I think that formality created a necessary complement. Like I wanted to have something fun to do on the side, basically, to not just put all my eggs in one basket and create some balance, right? And so I think Goodnight, Sweet Prince came out of that. It's focused on side characters, and it's interested in peripherality, and it tries to be fun at some level. So there's a lot more of the personal that's present in the essays that are published there. And I think too, it's a lot more personal, the process, where it's an excuse to, and maybe if territory is an excuse to talk to Tommy about whatever we wanted to talk about, and it got really serious, this is like an extension of maybe the conversations that you have at, after watching a movie with friends, or just you haven't even watched movies, you're just like talking about it over a drink, Yeah. And I wanted to create an environment to do that remotely when I'm not necessarily with all of my writing friends all at once. So I don't think that answers your question about how it connects back to my larger writing process, but maybe it shows how those two projects were born and where they come from. And maybe does speak to the writing process a little bit, where I'm like wildly ADD, but need to put some structure around things, right? And so like, oh, I get excited about something, I'm going to go wander into this territory over here. And maybe if it's going to stick for any amount of time, I have to put some parameters around it and make it feel physical and real. And so like a website is really good for that, or emailing people and bringing some other people into it makes it feel pretty real. So
For sure.
Yeah.
So today the actual poem we're going to be talking about appeared in the territory in your open edition, and it's Combing the Map Flat by Matthew Schmidt. I'm hoping that Matthew can read the poem and then we can talk a little bit about the structure of how you actually go through the editorial process. As someone who did this with you a couple times and who's been in workshops with you, I think you're a tremendously thorough person about that, but also I think you wisely do put parameters and a structure, and there's a process that I've seen you develop over time. But we can get more into that after we know what we're looking at. So I'm going to do a little screen share, and then hopefully Matthew can finally give us his melodious voice. All right.
All right, so this is the first draft that I sent to Nick and Tommy at the Territory. Combing the map flat. Its crooked roads branching from serene grids. Its water towers proclaiming what GPS claims before GPS can. Its dirt roads leading somewhere unmapped. The gods have decreed north is a pole striped like a barber's welcome. Its two ferries slicing so close, the lake is afraid. Captains brandishing fists, hollering. It's enlarging Greenland while shrinking Africa. It's Donald Trump's mouth opening and micro Trumps filing out. The wall is long and high and separates many people. It doesn't need to say anything in Spanish or English. Its canvas painted so realistic that patrons walk into the brick wall. The light of 10 giant diamonds on a wrist. The wrist a swarm of tunnels for gerbils. They run, smiling, content to end up in the same place, but having seen the underside of the wrist, felt a vein pulse. It's the dinosaur egg and Hitler's undiscovered underground. Hitler's past mustaches pinned behind glass like butterflies. Tiny, tiny butterflies of the upper lip. Their migration patterns astutely captured during propaganda films. It's the hills pushing back against your palms as you sharpen the creases. Your fingertips glistening the Pacific, knocking a speedboat into a wake. It's all the books on maps stacked on this map overnight. Interworld travel commences when an old map sheds a spruce onto the supine map. An ant walks into the present depiction. It doesn't appear as anything we've ever seen. The government spends exorbitant sums to bomb the ant. The ant, after surrendering, claims a second ant was in the tree. He trades time stuck like a butterfly behind glass to lead government mercenaries to the second ant. Riding in a mercenary's hands, the ant burrows under the skin to find the gerbils walking. He kills a gerbil and doffs its carcass. The furious mercenary is shorn of his arm. It's a discussion about how to figure out if a gerbil is a gerbil. A diagram of a gerbil is procured from the library where the maps snicker in their stacks. Rivers coughing up sediment at the sight of mercenary fingers on mice with balls in their abdomens. It's that mercenaries lack leadership, or that leaders lack selecting mercenaries, or that gerbils are slippery, but there aren't any gerbils in the wrist tunnels of the limb next to the tree in the northern quadrant of the map. The mercenaries get out a map to strategically map combing adjacent areas to the tree. It's how to suss out a gerbil that only knows the same tunnels that are drying up in the leafy overgrowth of the forest in the northern quadrant of the map. It's remembering that the gerbil is really an ant inside. It thinks like an ant, and wouldn't the ant tunnel? The mercenaries shovel up the area around the tree and find buku ants. It's the government warnings and slaughter of ants and protection and television ads and pundits and talk shows and blood. It's a mustache of ants that looks like a mustache. It's an ant that grows a mustache and calls it a map.
All right, Matthew Schmidt. So Matthew, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got to this poem My guess is you were reading Mark Leidner.
My guess was Gravity's Rainbow.
Okay.
I see. Yeah, that was actually one of our first conversations, though, so I'm a little primed to think that.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't read it. It hadn't been too long since I'd last read Gravity's Rainbow before writing this, and the same with Leidner. Of course, I'm always reading Leidner. You can't always just pick up Gravity's Rainbow and like read the whole thing so quickly. I guess I got to this poem because specifically of the open territory that was available for the call for the territory during this session. And since it was open, I kind of felt a certain ability to create my own map instead of necessarily thinking about a specific map already in existence. But of course, like the actual, site of any sort of map is constantly in your mind when you're thinking about maps. So it wasn't like there was no map. It was more like a confluence of maps that I was thinking about. Of course, I believe I sent this to the territory in 2016, near the end of it, and Trump had just been elected. So there was all of that talk about the wall he was going to put up between the United States and Mexico. That kind of comes in a little bit. And so I was thinking of other tyrants, and so Hitler made his way into the fold. But I suppose more than that, I was thinking about the difference between the 2D qualities of a map versus the 3D qualities of living on the space a map stakes out and allows us to like envision by looking down generally, or on a wall, like where you are in a particular region. And so one of the things that I'm most interested in is poetic leaps, jumps. And so I was thinking, like, how do you write about a 2D object while, erecting a 3D atmosphere, and how do they intertwine into each other and speak to each other?
Yeah, it's funny hearing that now too, because my notes in response to you weren't all that concerned with what you were describing. My notes were much more like formal. They didn't care as much about the thinking of the piece. But hearing you talk about that now, and just like hearing the language that you're using around like dimensionality, I'm remembering like the things that I notice about your writing in general is an interest in the cartoon. It's a space where like anything can happen. It seems like the cartoon, especially something that's going to be prankish or something that delights and entertains. And one of the things that's a really common trope in cartoons is like interplay between the literal and metaphoric, right? Like trade-offs between those. We're going to make the literal metaphoric or vice versa. And so you see that in moments in your poem with like moments of personification, like the lake being afraid for the two fairies coming close to one another. And I think that's just like a very natural impulse throughout your work, is to use the cartoon as an opportunity to create those leaps, right? Because there's a lot of really fun exchange that's happening there. I think naturally that's going to make you concerned with very territory-like concerns, because that questions of like representation are always at play there. I think specifically what you're talking about with dimensionality is really interesting, because people talk about cartoons or pornography or any other form that like simplifies or boils things down to archetype or stereotype or whatever or cliche. A lot of those are like reducing dimensionality, right? We don't have these three-dimensional characters where we can see their interiority. We see this very simplified exteriority. But maybe in doing that simplified exteriority, you access something else that's really interesting or exciting. And I think this poem is doing that. Any interiority that we're getting is you having fun supposing, right? And there's a lot of exteriority, like kind of in a in the language I used in my editorial notes was like the non sequitur, the idea of being able to use the leap as a way of like propelling the poem and making it really exciting. So I'm glad to hear you talk about that. And it's just connecting back to, I don't know, things that I'm thinking about a lot. I mentioned the genre writing that I'm doing earlier, very concerned with the archetype and like what makes something superficial or predictable, and how do you like complicate that? And do you always need to make it like dimensional to make it feel literary? Or are there other ways to like fuck with it, basically? So I'm glad to revisit the poem in the context of my own writing right now. And also like, I guess, revisit it and pay attention to its thinking a little bit more, because I think I've been pretty fixated on the formal critique of it that I gave, which I guess to get into that, my read of it at the time had been that this is basically two poems laced together, that there's the more it's these types of like, these fragments that have somewhat of an averted vision to one another, where they admit to not being about the same thing, but they're also admitting to being about the same thing by having the same structure, right? And then there's this other poem that's more narrative and has more, it's still in a fragment because it's just these like single stanza lines, but it's much more that there's continuity from line to line. They don't have such clear averted vision to one another, and they are accumulating in a way that's different. So I think there's a line later on where there's another on the lake, on the waterfront personification moment that calls back to the previous one. In the non sequitur version of it, that's a moment of accumulation where you can remember that previous reference and look back across a great distance in the poem. Like, oh, we're going back to like this water metaphor and we're seeing that, which is very different than like the gerbil continuing to do the same character doing something in section after section. And I think I was advocating for doing one or the other, or doing some type of like clever interplays between both, like making sure that your rhythms are as like attentive as possible. Because basically the it's part of the poem, the non sequiturs, I think falls off once we get very heavily into the gerbil ant mercenary narrative. And so I think the main thing that I was pushing for with my editorial suggestions was to like have more interplay between the two strains, right? Have them have the helix a little bit twistier, right? Rather than these big loops between the two. And I think you did do that. I don't know what your read of that, because we didn't really have much meta commentary at the time about like, do you agree with those edits? Like, what do you like about the edits? So I'd be curious to hear how you responded to those at the moment and how you're looking at them retrospectively, because, you know, we were just working.
Yeah, no, I think a couple things, right? Speaking of cartoons, you know, I've always loved cartoons for that ability to anything goes at any time. And one of the things that I think this poem is mimicking about cartoons is that often it'll be like gag, 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 and they keep building on each other. And like sometimes it'll go like somewhere completely different. And you're like, well, I don't, you know. But like, can you find a way, and it usually tries to, like, to loop back around somehow, because you have to end the cartoon, right? Of course, in the cartoon, generally, everyone gets to live, at least in the old Looney Tunes format, right? But like, you know, how am I able to do that in a poem? And so like the kind of one line stanzas or like 1 to 2 sentence stanzas, I think I kind of was thinking of as like, you know, one thing on the map, or like, you know, one thing that's happening in this open territory. And because it's wide open, I allowed myself a lot more leeway than I probably should have initially, which is where I think like, I mean, I don't know if I agree with that actually, but like to make the poem like a whole and cohesive in a certain way, right? Like sometimes you have to recenter your focus to make the actual experience somehow enjoyable for the reader. And so like, I think that the weaving in and out or the going back and forth that you suggested really changed the poem, particularly in its rhythm and its ability to grasp some narrative throughout the poem. And so like even rereading the draft, like there's one long paragraph that I was reading and I was like, oh, could have used the comma, could have used another, a completely another section, stanza. This is, it just wasn't, it wasn't there rhythmically, and it probably was taking the gag too far, or like the focus on one particular interaction between character A and character B that had gone as far as it could in that particular moment. Time to move on to like another moment or scene to like complicate the interest that you have in these characters if you're still watching, right? Like, so how do you get people to keep watching or keep reading the poem in this open area? So like, when I read your comments, I generally took a lot of them, and if I didn't necessarily take them directly, I was thinking about them very clearly when I was writing the next draft, so that in my mind, like even if I didn't directly adhere to maybe a prescriptive idea, like in my mind, I would be thinking about how do I connect like the concerns of the poem with connecting to some of the larger points as an editor you suggested.
Yeah, maybe this would be a good time to note like my general philosophy for how to give editorial notes, because I think it differs a little bit, or I've changed over time to respond to a frustration with like the normal workshop model. And I think, yeah, basically I have the most fun personally, and I think like the best results happen when basically you can create an atmosphere where instead of the classic model of like, I am the editor, you are giving me a piece, the piece is incomplete in some way, and I am to give you prescriptions for how to complete that work. Like that seems to be like not really honest to the way art works, where it's this kind of like continual ongoing thing, and basically when you publish something, that's not the end of it, and a lot of the concerns from the piece go unfinished and carry over to the next thing that you're working on, and it's a process as much as a product, and all these other things that like seem obvious when you step back, or we all feel like advanced beings who can like come to these realizations intellectually, but it's really hard to like get off the behavioral tract of like this very kind of like, I don't know, instilled like behavior that people have in the workshop and in their relationship with like a publisher. So I think it's important for me to create the feeling to some extent that we're not just like lobbing versions of the poem back and forth at one another, but that we're like looking a little bit side by side and trying to figure out how it's working. And like, maybe we're both equally puzzled by it at some level, and we're trying to figure out that puzzlement and have fun with it. And in this case, I had some prescription to it because I had like a vision for how it could be, right? So it's like, like you get excited with stuff, but then you don't want that excitement to lead to too much of a fingerprint or too much of a push on the writer, who ultimately is the primary author in this equation, right? The editor does take a secondary role. So I think in this case, I was more prescriptive than I normally was, where I'm normally a lot more analytic or descriptive, or like, here's what I see happening, because I'm like, oh, I think you could do it this way. But in general, I think I also layered in a lot of that kind of more analytic, observational stuff. So your comment that like, oh, yeah, I didn't necessarily take all of your prescriptions. I think secretly too, a prescription is just another way of giving analysis. Like you're just being more speculative or more preferential. Like, oh, here's what I like. My biases are telling me it should happen, but ultimately, you're not gonna just take my prescriptions at face value. That's yeah. So
yeah, I think like what you say about kind of this. It's not necessarily a workshop in the workshop model of an MFA per se, but like, I think your role as an editor like allows that space to open up where it is a collaboration, right? And just by simply talking about it over time, because we talked about it for several months via email, and I think it allows a space for the writer to see some things that they can't see in what they've written necessarily, that someone that did not write it, who's trying to understand it for the first time and then thinking about it for a while, like is able to grasp more quickly. Because sometimes I feel like blinded by what I was doing in a certain like moment or image or what have you. And then, you know, you'll point something out and I'll be like, oh, yeah, yeah. And then like it's that continual process of thinking that helps us try to grapple with what the poem is doing, what the concerns are, why this is interesting to both of us.
So Matthew and I have been thinking a lot about sort of we start this process of doing 1 week critique where we've been sometimes encountering friends, but also encountering all kinds of strangers and accumulating Facebook friends and seeing different kinds of work. And it's a very intimate experience because what we're doing is writing critique letters to people, and some folks want a lot more prescriptive feedback, and some folks are looking more to just have an audience, I think.
Yeah.
And neither of which is good or bad in and of itself. And, you know, at least one person in particular who we've both adored has come back a lot, and we've had this kind of interesting pleasure of sort of being part of the process of thinking out a whole series of poems.
Ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's really amazing for us, actually. It's amazing for me. I think it's amazing for Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one thing that I've been excited about with this, and I think reading the territory as opposed to other kinds of magazines, is that there's a sort of open-ended feel about it that introduces a lot of different kinds of genre. You've done everything from work about Borges to stuff like Matthew's poem, or Sarah Miner, who just agreed to do an interview with us today, which I'm excited about. Work that's sort of including like an integrating image and text and diagram and text and unconventional graphic, like narrative work. I think some of that feels really organic to what you do as a person, or what I would think you do, right? Like we were talking a little bit about this before the interview, but I'd like made a stack of like Nick Greer books, which includes like Gödel, Escher, Bach, and Crazy Cat, which Matthew, you should check out if we've never talked about it, but is like kind of intellectual, philosophical novel about a pre-existing cartoon. Blah, 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 blah. I'm interested in talking a little bit about how that editorial process and being open in that editorial process and sort of analyzing work as opposed to prescribing work or selecting work, but also the kinds of magazines you've had have led to that proliferation of literary oddities, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of different things that are driving this, this like kind of the oddities or the manyness of forms. I think one is that the aforementioned like ADD or restlessness, a desire to do a lot of different things, or at least at the very least be open to a lot of different things and supporting a lot of different things, has led to us to purposely work with people who are doing stuff that feels out there, or challenging in some way, especially challenging formally. I think that connects to another one of the drivers, which is if we're asking people to re-inspect this form, the map, that there's a lot of assumption about, a lot of assumptions about its objectivity and its ability to truth tell, then we should also probably be looking at literary objects and genres with a similar level of criticism. Otherwise, what are we doing? I think too, one of the things that people usually pick up on pretty quickly, just with my diction, is that like I have a background in doing a lot more like kind of like, I don't know, STEMmy or left brain pursuits. Like I studied math in undergrad and basically my day job or career or whatever is in coding at this point, like as a data scientist, as it's called now for whatever reason. So I think there's this element where I'm really interested in like literature as like information system, or like literature's ability to be about ideas, as you see in like science fiction, or literature's ability to embody certain ideas. And I think there's a really fraught relationship between like things being thinky or critical and things being like kind of imbued with a feeling of being about something. And I think people talk a lot about like art objects, like the best art is not often about something, but just is. And I think that's like going to be a pretty fraught false binary like any other. So I kind of want to unpack that and fuck with it in various ways. And so I think a lot of what I'm talking about with territory and a lot of how territory has come to be formally is like leveraging my abilities with coding. So a lot of the stuff that you see online is taking advantage of the uniqueness of the digital page beyond like, oh shit, I have a Squarespace, like how do I put stuff on a page? Like it's a little bit more advanced than that because I have this like toolkit, so that's been very useful. And I've really encouraged people to go further formally than what they maybe thought as a default. You know, you send me a Microsoft Word doc or a PDF, and there's certain things that we can do on web that you might not have defaulted to yourself. And so I like being kind of like an active enabler or catalyst for taking it to this other domain that's unique to the web. And two, I think being from this other world that's not literary, let's say, or there's an assumption that it's not literary. I like creating kind of like a semi-permeable membrane between those two things and creating points of bleed through that blurs the lines. I think that's really fun. So yeah, I think those are all really important drivers for how territory has begun to have the look and feel that it does and have the formal diversity that it does today.
Yeah. And do you feel like that's altered? I mean, I think the website is adapted over time, but do you think that's altered your own kind of, this is not really a meta question, but sort of a publication question about how a web page and a book start to look like each other, or how the sort of like aesthetic elements of the thing interact? I guess what I'm trying to ask is if you feel like you've tried to set the web page up visually in a way that lends itself specifically to the literary things that you're doing, and if you think you've pulled some of the work toward the website's visual aesthetic in that way,
Yeah.
in the way that you interact with that.
Yeah, I think basically again, there's like multiple drivers or strands that are part of this. Like I think one is that a lot of what the web reading experience needs to do is anchor itself in what people are used to in the physical, like analog page. And so thinking about even simple things like giving people an attractive font that looks like something that you'd see in a book, right? And not just using Comic Sans. Or if you're going to use Comic Sans, do it to some deliberate effect. But yeah, thinking through things like white space and section breaks and things like that that either adhere to or deliberately diverge from like book formats or like print publication formats and, or conventions is an important thing to think about. The other thing too is like web has its own kind of like endemic elements, both because it has this underlying kind of like technological infrastructure for how you publish to web, and also just conventions that have been built over time. Just that's the way people happen to have used the web. So like an example is like an input form that, you know, like remember like an input form at the bottom, like sign up for my guest book or whatever, like leave a note or something like that. That's like a very specific HTML object that like exists in the back end that people have like expanded on or manipulated over time. And so that's like a particular thing that's like unique to web that you're not going to find in a physical book in the same way. So now you have this both code and front end object, maybe like a genotype phenotype type of thing where you have this back end and front end relationship. And you now have this object that you can play with and utilize if you want. like one of the things that we did, that a piece by Beth Steedle about Newfoundland takes advantage, I think, of the relationship between a physical multiple choice that you do and a digital multiple choice that you might do. Think about how like a Scantron takes the like, you know, the paper and makes it digital for the convenience of grading and stuff. This piece, basically, you can like hover in a way that you can only do digitally. So you like things select differently, but then when you click, it fills itself in as you might see on like a paper selection. And then as you go through the piece, you've basically been selecting your answers to the exam that you're taking, that she's constructed. So there, I think there's that's kind of spans both the worlds and is really exciting, and there's some interplay between the two. So I think when we're talking about like Territory's form and its relationship to the original, there's certain to the analog page, there's certain things that we're doing that are anchored in the physical to like be nice to the reader basically, and not ask them to do too much mentally. You could say the exact same thing about certain web conventions that we've put in place, not make things too insane or divergent from what people would expect there. But when there's opportunities, create interesting and fun interplay between these different worlds, and maybe make people think a little bit more critically about the way that those worlds are constructed, the way representation works in each of those spaces.
Yeah. So Matthew's poem is actually on the web page, fairly conventional. I actually, today while I was pulling off the poem for this conversation to set up pairings, I was surprised that it was a pretty standard font for publication even, which doesn't look like that quite so big, which is my awkward turn, or one of my awkward turns to the poem itself. I'm gonna screen share again here.
Cool.
So Matthew can read his final rendition. But while we're doing that, notably, I think the artwork that you laid with this on the web page itself is really interesting and striking. I wonder, do you do that stuff yourself, or do you pull those off of like a sort of clip art situation?
Yeah, I think we're in like we're doing some pretty advanced clip art, is what I'll say. Like it's like we're doing some, like you could say, some archive digging or curatorial work. I feel like that's the way. If I you know, that's the academically inflated way of saying we're going to archive.org a lot of the time and taking screenshots, right? We're not stooping to the baseness of Getty images, but we're not really generating our own stuff. So there's a lot of, another thing too to mention with Territory probably is that in the absence of somebody like Matthews was writing for an open theme, and he was basically creating his own map, like a literary map. There's a lot of people who respond very specifically to maps that we've curated. So they're responding to an object that we've given them. They're writing the story that takes place in the map. They're writing about a specific map that fits in with one of the issue's themes. So a lot of the time the visual design of those title cards like decides on itself based off of the process that the writer has chosen. So in Matthew's case, we did some retrofitting where we found like visuals that seem to thematically connect back to the pieces. Because we published Coming the Map Flat with another one too.
Right, so here is the published version of Coming the Map Flat. It's crooked roads branching from serene grids. It's dirt roads leading somewhere unmapped. It's water towers proclaiming what GPS claims before GPS can. The wall is long and high and separates many people. It doesn't need to say anything. It's canvas painted so realistic that patrons walk into the brick wall. It's the dinosaur egg in Hitler's undiscovered underground. Hitler's past mustaches pinned behind glass like butterflies. Tiny, tiny butterflies of the upper lip. Their migration patterns astutely captured during propaganda films. It's enlarging Greenland while shrinking Africa. It's the hills pushing back against your palms as you sharpen the creases. Your fingertips glistening the Pacific, knocking a speedboat into a wake. It's two ferries slicing so close, the lake is afraid. It's all the books on maps stacked on this map overnight. An ant walks in to the present depiction. It doesn't appear as anything we've ever seen. The government spends exorbitant sums to bomb the ant. The ant, after surrendering, is stuck like a butterfly behind glass. The ant, after surrendering, claims a second ant was in the tree in the northwest quadrant of the map. Writing in a mercenary's hands, the ant burrows under the skin to find the gerbils tunneling. He kills a gerbil and doffs its carcass. The furious mercenary is shorn of his arm. It's a discussion about how to figure out if a gerbil is a gerbil. The mercenaries get out a map to strategically map, combing adjacent areas to the tree. The mercenaries shovel up the area around the tree and find buku ants. It's remembering that the gerbil is really an ant inside. It thinks like an ant, and wouldn't the ant tunnel? It's the government warnings and the slaughter of ants and protection and television ads and pundits and talk shows and blood. It's a mustache of ants that looks like a mustache. It's an ant that grows a mustache and calls it a map.
So, a way tighter version of this poem. I think, and a differently compelling one. What is it that you liked about the final version of the poem, Nick, that made you actually want to put it in the territory? What made it fit the other work you were doing and open?
Well, I mean, I already wanted to put it in. Like, I think as a starting point, I really liked what it was doing already. It was just a matter of that, like, how many times do we want to go back and forth and keep pushing it and seeing if we can get it to be more of itself or more to some actualization of what its goals are. And so I think, I mean, my initial critiques were so much around rhythm and like the types of poems that it was, that I think moving away from the narrative being so dominant from the halfway point basically to the end, and making the narrative move faster with more surprising leaps made it feel a little bit more like the its sections than non sequiturs. It made the narrative sections feel more like what came before. And there's also more kind of like feathering in of the its sections throughout. And so I feel like it was able to create this sustained energy along these two poems where you have this sustained energy of like the excitement of the leaps, like where are the leaps going to go? Are the leaps going to call back? What is actually the it what's the central mystery? Like what is the it, right? And then on the other side, the narrative piece was accumulating and things were like characters were sustaining and transforming. But it was no longer kind of like dominating the excitement and mystery of the piece, right? It really did feel like that double helix. And so I was excited by the balance that Matthew found in this version of the poem.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that, and maybe if you don't mind, we'll put some of that on the website as well, but I want to emphasize that like when Matthew says months, I've watched you do this with people, like including myself, where you actually will go back and forth over a very long period of time, working out like to the comma edits of things and to the word edits of things, and often writing essays on portions of pieces, but which I think is phenomenal and rare and strange, and I don't know you to do it. But it's also, I think, interesting to watch that process happen and for it to be kind of open-ended. I like this work. I want to see this work do its absolute best thing so we can present it doing its absolute best thing. I'm hoping, Matthew, you can talk a little bit about that on the back end of the experience.
I mean, while we're saying like we'll go back and forth for months, like it's not overwhelming in any way. And like one of the things that I appreciate the most is a literal breaking down of the operation within a line, a sentence, or, you know, how one thing is connecting to another thing. And so, like, there's, in my mind, like I went back and read the comments recently, and like there is no, it's not like Nick is simply like saying things to say things. Like he is demonstrating how things are operating in a way that help you understand your own work better than you understood it while writing it the first time, or even, you know, revising it. And so that's you know, maybe the opposite of what I was calling prescriptive earlier, where like it literally is just you know, a discussion of the rhetorical moves per se in a poem. And so like I think that was so useful again for like things like this conversation, for example, right? Like the editing experience lets us put together two minds. This particular conversation is three minds, where we simply get to be in this place that allows us to verbalize what it is we're thinking about with art as we progress with our engagement in said field.
Yeah. And also, like, I want to be real about this too, is like, I think it's like this mixed blessing, right? Like we're all bringing all sorts of our like desires and like kind of anxieties to the writing and editing process. And like, I think one of the reasons that I am so like detailed or like mincing, or then you can put it like on the other side, like laborious or just an absolute punisher. Like like I care about detail and precision, and I find myself often wandering towards like, you know, a lazier, more surface version of things. And I feel like I always get so much more out of like art and out of life when I do commit to the detail. And so I think a lot of times the editorial process that I take on is affirmational at some level, like a reminder that like, actually, this is really how I get the most out of the world. But of course, that isn't always the way other people go. And so like, I think too, being more, usually the more intense or more like kind of like invested of the two, and like not really having good breaks, you know, for going in on things. Like I always like, I don't know, I leave it to the other person to tell me when it's like, no, we're gonna you know, we're gonna pull the eject button or like pull the ripcord on this one, and like, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine, because I know that tendency in myself and want to like leave room not just to be the crazy person, right? But I think there are people who like really get into it, and we're really chopping it up, and it feels like good, like we're having a session, right? We're like really going into it. And so it just, everyone has different appetites for different styles. And I don't know, I want to make room for that. But I'm also doing a lot of like cherry picking of the people who I know like think like me or have sensibilities like me, you know? I had somebody who basically I gave the type of edits that I was describing earlier, which are like super analytic, like here's what it's doing, basically a critique letter. The person was like, nah, like you're my editor, just tell me what, like the 5 things you want me to do and I'll do them. Or maybe I won't. And I was like, okay. And then I did that exact thing, gave them what they wanted, and we went from there. And it's a great piece and we published it and I'm proud of it. So it's like, I don't know. You need to be able to I don't know, get off your bullshit sometimes.
Yeah, I think like one of the simple examples is in the earlier version, I had something about the wall talking Spanish or English, and we kind of discussed, you brought up the idea that that might limit the territory too much. In that the later version, I think it says it doesn't need to say anything, right? So it takes out the locale or possible locales and expands the territory that much more. And so I think like something like that allows the reader to, you know, move within this open territory much more than they would have been, say, those 2 languages were the only 2 languages, and thus like limiting the area and scope of the territory.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Adam.
Oh no, I think like when when I heard you were doing an open edition of the territory, I didn't immediately go to like just a blank grid or like a Cartesian plane, right? Like, which is interesting, and I think there's something about watching you go through your notes and think out that concept on the back end that is actually really exciting to do and see all of the ways that you're thinking about it, all of the ways that Matthew is thinking about it, and then all of the ways other people that you're dealing with are thinking about what that openness is, as opposed to like my immediate thought, which was like, we're on issue 4, maybe we don't have an idea for what like map we're going to do.
That's the beginning. That's always the beginning, right? Like, but then of course, this is the thing. Tommy and I started off being like, we like maps, and then it has to get real heady, and that's just where it goes.
Yeah. But you were saying,
I just, yeah, I think my edit towards the idea of Spanish and English, like, you know, you mentioned you were writing this in 2016, and there was this like, I think, topical component, but I think the theme of open as an issue mixed with what you were trying to do with like this open-ended map, unless you're going to do the like multiple exposure photography strategy where you have this multiplicity of specifics like Spanish, English among many, or you're going to go for the totally drained version where you have like these kind of like archetypal representatives of things like language as a concept, right? Then you're kind of in this limbo ground where it seems topical and based in a very particular space and time, but it's also not, because you have like the ant, the gerbil, these like kind of more, I don't know, I'm reaching for the phrase objective correlative, but that's definitely not what this shit is. So I don't know what I'm saying, but like this kind of more like abstracted object, or this, yeah, it's not an archetype, but these, I don't know, I think of the John Riccio, like he loves vocations. There's a specificity to the vocation, but it's not the person specifically doing the job, right? So there's an abstraction, but also a specificity. And I think that's the tightrope that you're walking in this poem that's tough to figure out. That I think you figured it
out. Well, I appreciate that.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up a little bit. Before we do, as always, folks can find us at oneweekcritique.com, the number 1. But Nick, you've got all kinds of ways for folks to reach out to you through your various projects, through your Calvino Prize winning chapbook, through Nick-Greer.com even.
That's the one. Everything's linked from there.
Okay.
Just let them go there. They'll find it. Yeah.
Thank you again for having a chat with us. And,
yeah.
Matthew, thank you for being willing to share your poem.
Of course.
Yeah. I'm glad to mix up the format too. That's very territory, right?
That's right. That's what
I'm
we're doing.
infecting you guys.
It's too much, man.